Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. Ukraine War News Update, first part thereof, for the 6th of October 2024. I am sorry this is late, it is Saturday morning and or it's not even the morning, it's the afternoon now, goodness me. Right, we're going to start with the Ukrainian General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply. You can find those caveats in the description to the video below, and if you want to criticize these stats, feel free to, but make sure you read, or my use of these stats, make sure you read the caveats first. Okay, personnel lost 1,250 is a pretty high number, well, very high number. We've seen that sort of figure now for the last week. We were over 1,300. Now we're sort of at the upper end of that 1,000 to 1,300 range. 3 tanks is going down from it was pretty much on the daily average yesterday. Going down to 3 possibly might signify they're either don't have as many tanks they'd like to have, or they're not attacking as much on the front lines. 21 troop carrying AFVs is high. It's over the daily average, but only by snip, so not as high as we have seen on previous days, but still significant. 55 artillery systems is obviously very high. That's over 3 times the daily average, so high in that category. 101 vehicles and fuel tanks lost in a single day. That is indeed a hefty loss in that category. In fact, let's go and see where that sits as far as the daily averages are concerned. 101, 105 is the record, so it's almost a record lost. A loss that is really significant. What do we have as a daily average? 27.16. I mean, virtually every day is above 27 these days. So I think that trajectory, if we look at vehicles and fuel tanks, thanks to Dell for these stats, this is what you're going to see these days, is just way more than 27. That average is just going to keep creeping up, even though the trend line's gone down a little bit. There's that patch of a couple of weeks where there was just not an awful lot of stuff lost by the Russians, and then it seems to have really picked up again. But even if the trend line sort of plateaus somewhat, every day pretty much the Russians are losing huge amounts of those vehicles because they're just using things like golf buggies and motorcycles, and I think that's and quads, ATVs. I think that's what you'll see in that category. 19 pieces of special equipment, things like excavators, maybe radars, stuff like that. 19 of those lost in a day is obviously going to hurt. But it's quite a wide category, so unsure as to what that may be. But that's still a high number there. 19. Let's have a look at the data again. We've got special equipment. Highest is, 99, but that was the day that the figures were, I think that was incorrect by the General Staff. So Dell contacted me. He's like, I don't know what to do with this, because they put 99 in special equipment, but I think that was in vehicles and fuel tanks. And there was 0 in vehicles and fuel tanks. So I think they just made a mistake, and that's kind of skewed the data. He didn't quite know what to do with that, but otherwise the daily average is 3.52. So to lose 19, I think is incredibly significant. Unfortunately, that data point then skews how he interprets like 19 as far as, or the sheet interprets it as far as whether it's a bad day or not. 19 would normally be dark red, but now 99 is skewing what becomes dark red. Anyway, that's my tuppence there. So bad day at the office, I think, for the Russians in a number of categories there. Right, we're going to look at some Andrew Perpetual loss lists, and he's got another 2 to add to yesterday's ones. So he's just got an awful lot of work on his plate at the moment. Right, so we're looking at 3rd and 4th before we look then to the 5th. So the 3rd and the 4th, you can see that the loss stats, the overall numbers are very bad for the Russians. I mean, we're really talking, 5 to 1 there. If you take out the blacks at the bottom, which are civilian vehicles driven by civilians, which is terrible. Those are war crimes, horrific. And same at the bottom there. That's about 4 to 1, maybe 3 to 1 loss ratio there, 3.5 to 1. That's probably a 4 to 1, maybe 4.5 to 1 there. So bad numbers overall. We look at combat asset losses for the first day, the 3rd. Then we have about a 2 to 1 combat asset losses. And for the 4th, we have probably about a 3 to 1. Okay, now let's look at the actual stuff that was lost, and we'll see if we can draw any sort of conclusions, find out any nuggets. We have a Leopard 1A5 damaged. What else? We've got in the APCs, Striker, Humvee, Senator. So your Western equipment really heavily represented in the APCs and MRAPs. Almost always sort of 90% plus is either Ukrainian made or Western provided. A captured MRAP there, Kirpi, that's the Hedgehog. The Turkish provided vehicle there. Nothing too significant. Interesting that Leopard 1A5 is on the list there, so we're starting to see maybe the application of Leopard 1A5s to the front line. They've been updated by the Germans. Hopefully would have fairly decent optics and fire control systems to allow them to target to acquire targets quicker than targets can acquire them. So even though it's an older tank, sort of I guess T-72 era tank, T-80 tank, if it's been upgraded, it might have the advantage over those tanks in terms of acquiring targets. Civilian vehicles, a few of those destroyed and damaged, but nothing too crazy. Now for the Russians, first and foremost, a huge number of civilian vehicles, motorcycles. Look at all those motorcycles and loafs, the Scooby-Doo vans, trucks and all sorts, motorcycles there again. I mean, wow, that is a motorcycle massacre, really, in one single day. And it go, when you then go back to the Ukrainian general staff losses for the Russians on a daily basis, losing 101 vehicles and fuel tanks. When you've got that many, I know it's a different day, but when you've got that many motorcycles on this day on the scouring the socials, and you understand that category can skew pretty high because of that. Right, a Tor M1 damaged air defense system. That's going to be useful for the Ukrainians. Got 2 damaged Brad 21 Grads, multiple launch rocket systems. We've seen quite a few MLRS being targeted and taken out by the Ukrainians at the moment. We have a T-90 destroyed, T-90M. That's their best tank. That's abandoned and hit by an FPV drone. There's some footage, I don't know if it'd be on yesterday's figures, of a T-90 getting taken out and fundamentally disassembling. We've got track garden sheds, other tanks, so on and so forth. We've got about 10 tanks, just under 10 tanks there, and a dozen or so infantry fighting vehicles, BMP-1s, 2s, and whatnot. Most of those destroyed and abandoned. And yeah, just quite a lot of losses there. That will no doubt leave the Russians in a bit of a bind if they continue to lose vehicles at this kind of rate. And then we look at the next day, and yeah, it seems to be that is the case. Okay, looking at the Ukrainian losses, quite a few Starlinks at the top, not too bothered about that. Radar AN TPQ-50 there, I think that's that counter battery radar. It's that smaller one that you see quite often lost, so it's not like the biggest loss there. And we have, sometimes it's on the back of things like Humvees. You can see them, I think, AN TPQ-50. Let's put that in just to remind you guys, TPQ-50. And let's have a look, which is the best way to look at these. Yeah, that's one. Radar upgrade counter battery fire, so exactly that. Yeah, so that's it on the back of a Humvee. So when you see that, it's not like a Nebo, like $100 million piece of kit, like an array or something of that type. It's a much smaller bit of kit. Okay, we have a barge that's been damaged, a boat, a couple of artillery pieces, a few tanks there damaged, mainly infantry fighting vehicles damaged, a couple of Bradleys by night vision, FPV drones, and then some APCs and MRAPs and whatnot. Nothing too significant there for the Ukrainian losses. When we come to the Russians losses, we have an awful lot of loafs and motorcycles. Again, these vehicles being used by the Russians, and again, like to lose that many means that they're using that many. And if they're using that many civilian vehicles, the question is, why are you using that many civilian vehicles? Why are you using all those motorcycles? Is that a benefit to you, or are you doing that because you have to? And if you're doing it because you have to, what does that say about the state of the Russian materiel? Okay, trucks, a few of those, ATVs, a couple of quads and buggies thrown in. And then we have an awful lot of surveillance and comms equipment. We have a 96L6 TSP radar. Have no idea. 96L6, is that one that's used for 96L6? 6 radar. I think that's using air defense system. Is that one to do with the S400? Yeah, it's the S400 there. So that is a significant one. That was one of the videos I referenced for you guys the other day. So that is actually a high value bit of kit there, right there. That one damaged by Switchblade. Interesting. That's the American provided loitering munition. Okay, engineering vehicle, a bunch of artillery, some Mr. B's, a Tulpan. That's the 240mm self-propelled howitzer. Mortar. Sorry, destroyed. So a few artillery pieces destroyed. Don't usually get that many destroyed, so that's fairly good for the Ukrainians. Usually they get damaged. Track garden sheds. One of those. I don't know if it's from this day, but I've seen I think it was the one that's just shot its turret way up into the air that I'm going to show you. I think that was a track garden shed. I'm not sure. A huge explosion. Anyway, about 8 tanks there taken out. About 10 infantry fighting vehicles, almost all of them destroyed or abandoned. BMP 2s and 3s, BTR 82s. Got APCs as well. Usual kind of mass, but that radar is going to hurt particularly. Although it's damaged, don't know how badly. Something like that's going to be very sensitive. So you damage something like that, it's probably going to hurt. Right, then we come on to yesterday's one. So it's a bit of a catch up there. And we can see that far fewer things have been taken out compared to the previous days. But this is still pretty significant, right? The combat asset losses, if you're not including air defenses, is about 1.5 to 1, maybe 2 to 1. Russian to Ukrainian losses. Take out decoys at the bottom. Overall, that's about 3 to 1 loss ratio. That's pretty good for the Ukrainians, but we can see right at the top that there's a number of air defense systems in there, and that's going to be fairly costly for the Russians in terms of money to replace and capability. Okay, for the Ukrainians, not really much to report. Some Humvees, Senators, MTLBs, stuff like that, damaged, destroyed, but nothing too serious. A bunch of trees that the Russians have claimed they hit a howitzer, a mortar and a howitzer, but were just trees. And also a decoy as well, proper decoy there, TRML-4D. So that's a radar provided by the Germans. Well, it would be if it was a real one, but that looks to be a decoy. Now, we come to air defense, and we've got a number of air defense pieces here. If we go back to air defense in the stats, remember that they've had a bad week for air defense units, or a couple of particularly bad days. So we go up to anti-aircraft and look at the numbers. So 5, okay, 1, 1, 2, and then 7 there. That was what I was referencing. That's a really bad day at the office to lose that many. 3, 2, so quite often 0. It's not a category that you're always going to get things on a daily basis, but a few spikes here. A day of 5, a day of 7, a day of 3. That's going to hurt. And then when we look at Andrew's list here, we see 4 air defense systems and that drone, the S-70. So that S-70 is a stealth drone that is probably worth an absolute ton of money, because that is at the cutting edge. There's only a couple of those made. It's at the cutting edge of what they're capable of doing in terms of that kind of munition. Stealth, massive drone. I mean, the size of a jet, and it had to be shot down because it was unresponsive. So, yeah, bad news for the Russians there. 4 air defense systems, all destroyed. Strela 10 short range. We've got a Book M3 and a Book M1 or 2, M1-2. So that's going to hurt. The Russians losing quite a bit of air defense capability, all in one fell swoop there, it seems. Couple of bits of artillery, not an awful lot. Couple of tanks, not an awful lot. A few infantry fighting vehicles and APCs. Virtually everything is destroyed and abandoned. So that's a really bad ratio for the Russians in terms of damage to destroyed and abandoned. A couple of trucks and a fair amount of civilian vehicles thrown in there, and a couple of ATVs. So Russians having a really bad day, mainly because of that S-70 drone, which is like huge. Landed safely in the house, and 4 air defense systems. So all in all, the Russians are still continuing to use, as according to verified empirical data, an awful lot of kit. Right, Andrew Perpetua then says, when I started, so if you remember, alongside this, and I haven't reported this often, a couple of times I dip in and say, oh, the average for verified human losses has, gone up. He started, as he looks at all the videos he does on a daily basis and says, and makes these, compiles these databases, right, which is, and remember he skews to looking at Russian sources more than Ukrainian sources to try and make sure he's not being biased. That was one criticism the other day. Didn't understand how this database is put together, and I don't think realised the critic didn't realise that these weren't just pulled out your backside. These are all geolocated, visually confirmed pieces of equipment. But he also, on the videos of people getting blown up, committing suicide, having being shot, whatever, all those horrific videos that we see of the personnel losses, he's adding those up. Now, these do not include people that are inside tanks and infantry fighting vehicles that absolutely explode. And you think, right, there's clearly no one left in there, but we don't know how many people are in there. It wasn't abandoned. It was being used. This is literally, I can see a human being. He's on camera. He dies. Tick. As in, add that to the ledger. It's macabre, it's horrible, but actually it is useful to get a sense of trends in exactly the same way as we do with the equipment, and also get a sense of, it's interesting to know what the verifiable data in personnel losses is compared to the claims by Ukrainian general staff. Okay. He said, when I started counting dead Russians, the first 2 weeks or so were 60 a day. It was disappointingly few, because we averaged far more than that prior to me starting to count. So he was like, well, just anecdotally, we're 100 a day. So he then decided to start counting, and it was only 60 a day. I wonder if that coincided with the that lack of here. So around this area where everything seemed to go down weirdly for a couple of weeks here. This is artillery. You see there's a massive gap there. So it could have coincided with that. I don't know. Anyway, but now we're getting 100 to 150 per day, which I think is a real average. In short, the number isn't increasing. The first 2 weeks were freakish outliers. In other words, it's not like things have got worse. It's that those 2 weeks were generally anomalous. It's on pace for 34,000 dead per year, which is a lot. It works out around 0.15% of the Russian men of fighting age dying per year. Just what we see and can count. So this is going to be your massive minimum. This doesn't include strikes on a command center, strikes on a training base, strikes on anything, behind the lines in the deep rear, tanks blowing up, infantry fighting vehicles. This is just human beings that you see die on camera, right? This is going to be a real small fraction of the number of people who are dying on a daily basis on the front lines, in this case for the Russians. It is 1.3% of the portion of the population Russia says that they can expend on the war dying per year. That's just what they are seeing, 100 to 150 a day. Ukrainian General Staff claiming killed, wounded, deserted POWs, 1,250 a day. But I wonder how many of that is dead, a dead Russian soldiers. And then of those, how many are Andrew Perpetua catching and his team catching on a daily basis. Right, I showed you the Nausio losses for the Pokrovsk area that are still around 5-1, 5 Russian losses to 1 Ukrainian losses. Ukrainian losses have ticked up a little bit, or the ratios closed a little bit. That was 3.5-1 in the last section of counting. And I suggested that's probably because the Ukrainians are doing counterattacks in Pokrovsk and doing active defense there. So they're committing more of their own vehicles. So their losses will naturally go up a little bit. Could also be that the Russians just have less equipment, like we see from looking at these sort of figures. And then you wonder, how can you keep committing this kind of equipment and 3 tanks in a day? Is that because you're running out, etc., etc.? And then you go back to here and you think, okay, that ratio is closing a little bit. I wonder if this also, though, includes things like motorcycles. I don't know if infantry mobility vehicles would include motorcycles, and also things like your buggies as well. So if they're not included on here and Russia is using a whole ton of those, yeah, what does that say about the data? You know, we look back at here and we see 101 vehicles and fuel tanks. You look at these lists and you're seeing an absolute bucket load of motorcycles, particularly the day before, actually, wasn't it? An absolute ton of motorcycles there, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what that says about that. But anyway, George Barros then looks at this NALCO. So he's from the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank. He looks at this data and says incredible Russian losses on the cross front. So as I say, 5-1. Russia burned through over a tank division's worth of tanks and at least 4 to 5 mechanized divisions worth of infantry fighting vehicles and APCs. All of that lost to advance a grand total of 30 kilometers west of Avdiivka over the past 8 months. Actually, this might be a good time to bring in this. We'll talk about this here. Actually, it's probably a good time. So Ukraine says Euromaidan impressed. Oh no, not that one. Darn, wrong one. Send that back. This is what happens when I do things on the cuff. It's not that one either. I think it's I laid it up. I changed it because I wanted to talk about that. Oh darn. Anyway, we'll find it soon. It's the amount of land that here it is. The amount of land that the Ukrainians have taken. So in 1 year, Russia took 0.1% of Ukrainian territory. So the amount of land the Russians taken of Ukraine. And I've showed you this map and said, all things considered, the Russians haven't really achieved all that much. It's really underwhelming. We talked about this in terms of percentage of Ukraine that they now control, what they controlled a year ago, and this is the second greatest army in the world. And well, Roman Sheremeter says in 1 year Russia took 0.1% of Ukrainian territory. At this phase, it would take Russia roughly 800 years and 2.4 billion more soldiers to take the rest of Ukraine. But even these small advancements could have been stopped had the West sent more aid. So, okay, let's understand the perspective here that this is, well, first and foremost, Russians are losing stupendous amounts of kit and people, and they're taking relatively small amounts of land. We can really get depressed about these fields that they're losing here and there, and a town and a village, and even Prokrovsk as a larger settlement. You can get really depressed that the Russians are just grinding on, but at such a huge cost that actually, if you map that across the rest of Ukraine, trying to take the rest of Ukraine, you just physically wouldn't be able to do it at the rate they're going at the moment. In other words, Ukrainians are really doing a really very good job of stopping the Russian army. Like, we can talk about how desperate they are, but the Russians are not doing a very good job. And that might sound like hope, and it might sound like cope to someone who wants me to be, brutally objective, but that to me is objective. It's like, those are the stats. These are the things that Russia is losing on a daily basis. And these are verified, confirmed losses in a cross region 5-1. Yeah, they are taking rubberized settlements. Whoop-de-doo. Well done, Russia. You have sacrificed how many people to do that and how many tanks to do that. And what does that say about your ability to do that next year? When you are 50% of the artillery ammunition you are using is coming from North Korea, you are in a desperate situation. Things are not looking good for the Russians. And it sounds overtly positive, and not to talk about how difficult it is for the Ukrainians, of course. But all things considered, they're doing a pretty damn good job. Now, here is an incredible turret tossing. We haven't seen turret tossing that much for a long time. Donetsk Oblast, a Russian T-72 sends its turret roughly 250 feet, 76 meters into the air after catastrophic ammunition detonation. You can actually go and look at the video in OSINT Technicals one there. I won't show it to you because I'll get in trouble, but that is that's a single explosion for a tank. Wow. Okay, then we have a T90 here. This is a main battle tank for the Russians. It's their best tank. It goes and does its stuff, firing at the Ukrainians a number of times, and then it gets hit, and my goodness, that goes up big time. It is a pretty significant explosion where, you'll be struggling to survive that. And I have a feeling, I was trying to look, I looked like the commander was out the hatch there, which is kind of useful for visuals, but there's no way he survived that explosion around him. But you never know. It's incredible how many people do survive these pretty horrendous explosions. Right. We have a Ukrainian kamikaze drone, the Ram drone, which is one that they had configured to be a kind of a Lancet equivalent, but it's a fixed wing one. It hasn't got the X-wing, but it does pretty much the same as a Lancet. Being used, we have seen previous videos of it being used quite successfully. Here we've got a Book 1 and a Book M1 and a Book M3 air defense system being hunted down and taken out by these, and having the kind of cook-off that we expect. And then we go back to Andrew Perpetua's loss lists and see two of those books are probably from that video, those two from that video listed on his losses. You can go and watch that video by clicking on the link in the description to this video below. Now we're going to go on to that S-70 drone that we thought originally was a Su-25 and then turned out to have been this stealth drone, cutting edge stealth drone, although with all the rivets it had in its wings, I can't imagine it was particularly stealthy. And the vapor trail behind it is like, yeah, it might be stealthy, but I can see it. I can see it up there. Anyway, Romanov, a Russian propagandist, claims that the Russians lost control of their S-70 and shot it down to avoid it being recovered in full by the Ukrainians, allegedly by a Su-57. So what was flying after it was a stealth fighter. A Su-57 that's not often used in this war because A, I don't think they've got too many of them. B, they might not be quite as good as they were telling people. Fifth generation stealth, supposedly stealth fighter. We saw one being transferred recently. It's covered in rivets. You're thinking, how's that a stealth fighter jet? Anyway, also they might not have that many pilots trained up on it, so on and so forth. So it's not really being used. And what's the point of having your very best fighters, very best jets, if you're not going to use them? It seems really weird. Anyway, they've used one to shoot down their own aerial vehicle. So yeah, there you go. Wreckage fell into the Ukrainian-controlled area. So that's what the Russians themselves are saying of that, which was in the end what the conclusion was from most OSINT people. Here you can see that S-70 falling down. It's definitely an F-70, like the shape of it is exactly that. That footage came out later after I'd done my videos. S-70 Ochotnik UCAV for sure. And that's what it looks like when it's in its full glory. Now, a human is about the size of that flat there. I mean, this is a big bit of kit, right? So don't think that that's sort of thing that a human comes up to a human's knees. That is, a human stands on that and looks fairly tiny. So it's a big bit of kit. Okay, right. Then there is a talk about hits and losses. This interesting piece in New York Times: Ukraine's Donbass strategy: retreat slowly and maximize Russia's losses. So this is what I've been talking about. Like, if this is truly happening, then this is exactly the right tactic, which is you can have a field, you can have a village, you can have a town. As long as we are bleeding you for this as much as humanly possible, and in terms of your materiel, then this is fine for you to have this small amount, relatively small amount of land. Question is, okay, what do you do afterwards? How do you get that back? But for the time being, this is forcing the Russians to expend inordinate amounts of resources. I'm just going to pick out a few paragraphs to read. So, to outside observers, so places like Mariinka, Vuhledar being taken by the Russians, slow but steady retreat from the Donbass region, the main theatre of war today, may seem to signal the beginning of the endgame, with Moscow firmly gaining the upper hand on the battlefield, leveraging its overwhelming advantage in manpower and firepower. But Ukrainian commanders and military experts dispute that, saying that a more crucial fight is unfolding in the region that goes beyond simple territorial gains and losses. It is now a war of attrition, they say, with each side trying to exhaust the other by inflicting maximum losses, hoping to break the enemy's capacity and will to continue the war. All summer, Russia was sending waves of troops backed by columns of armoured vehicles and brutal assaults, regardless of the casualties, and saturating the skies with drones, shells and bombs. Ukraine, a country a fraction of the size of Russia and with about a third of the population, is at an inherent disadvantage in this kind of battle. It has fewer men to send to the front, and despite an influx of Western military aid, remains largely outgunned on the battlefield. So that has left Kiev with little choice but to adopt what Mykola Bieliskov, a military analyst at Ukraine's government-run Institute for Strategic Studies, called a strategy of trading space for Russian losses. The idea is to retreat from towns under attack after exacting the highest price it can on manpower and materiel. Quote, it's a matter of how much they lose before they realise it's futile. Alexander Solonko, member of Ukraine's 411th Drone Battalion, who is fighting in the frontline city of Pokros, said of the Russians, but faced with relentless assaults, he added some Ukrainian commanders also, quote, prefer to abandon a position or a settlement if it reduces personnel losses. So this is exactly what I've been talking about ad infinitum, right? Ukraine ultimately hopes that Russia's mounting losses will make the war unsustainable for the Kremlin before it becomes so for Kyiv. This is the most important thing, to exhaust the enemy. And this is why, back to me, this is why asymmetries are really important. How many drones can you produce? How many drones can you use? Are you better at using drones? What type of munitions do you have on board the drones? Can we utilize AI to make drones even more efficient? So that's just one area where Ukraine has this asymmetry, and you've got to absolutely hammer that advantage, because that advantage turns into greater attrition for the Russians. How do you turn your lack of artillery ammunition into not an advantage, but how do you mitigate not having as much? Well, you have better target acquisition, ISTAR. You know, your intelligence, surveillance, targeting and reconnaissance needs to be better than the Russians so that you are hitting them more efficiently. And you need to have better howitzers that are maintained better, that have better barrels, that have better ammunition itself, that's constructed more rigorously, or maybe you're using particular types of ammunition that can go further, or have GPS guidance on, or whatever. There are ways that you mitigate your lack against the Russians in comparison to the Russians, and turn something that's looking bad into some kind of advantage. Okay, we have fewer troops, we've got fewer vehicles. Are our troops better trained? Are our vehicles more survivable? If we're using a Bradley against them using a like an MTLB, like if that's what we can do more often, then we will eke out these advantages and turn that into greater ratios, greater attrition ratios. And then we go back to this, and then we look to see if that is actually happening. Like all I do on a month, this is why I get really annoyed when people come along and just watch one video and then criticize me because, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. Why haven't you talked about this? Why over the course of my 2.5 years of doing this, I've talked about all of those things, right? And I come to the conclusion, looking at all the data, that this is exactly what is going on. And it's the only way it can be for the Ukrainians, because they are at a disadvantage in terms of personnel and pieces of kit. Now, the frustration comes when the Americans and allies don't provide enough stuff, or do and then attach restrictions to them. That means that the Ukrainians are limited in what they can do in terms of going further with those attrition rates. Okay, how realistic is this strategy? So anyway, Zelensky, that's what Zelensky said. This is the most important thing, to exhaust the enemy. He said in a nightly address. But how realistic is the strategy? Putin has put his country's economy on a war footing and has shown no sign he's prepared to quit the fight. And the Russian people seem steadfast in their support of the war. Ukrainian and Western officials point to rising Russian casualty figures, nearly 1,200 a day in August this year, according to the advisor to the British military, Nicholas Alcott, as evidence of the war's heavy toll on Russia. Throughout the year, Russia's lost roughly 3 armoured fighting vehicles for every Ukrainian one. So 3-1 AFV lost. According to Oryx, a military analysis site that counts only visually confirmed losses. Analysts from the Royal United Services Institute, a London-based military and security research organisation, estimated that the current rate of losses and the production of replacements, Russia is likely to exhaust its stocks of armoured fighting vehicles by 2026. I wonder whether that's a little bit conservative, though, and we talked about that before with Jack Watling and people from RUSI, I think, being a little bit statistically siding with the Russians in an unjustified way. But anyway, you get the general point. Mr. Gailey, who conducted a similar survey, said Russia by then would be able to afford only 1 or 2 battles of the scale of Avdiivka in terms of losses of armoured vehicles. So there you go, so on and so forth. you got manpower disadvantages, material disadvantages, but it's eking out those advantages where you can to turn, fields into material and personnel losses for the Russians. So there you go. Just to take that, actually in the other bits and pieces, there's something else to add to that in terms of what Ukraine are planning on doing themselves. Okay. There have been a couple of, this isn't the only one, by the way. There's a bus hit like this, a coach bus, and then there was a minibus bus hit yesterday by the Russians in Kherson. So I was interviewing Brendan Kelly recently, a couple of times, from Turchny, who's counting up these attacks in particularly the Kherson area, where the Russians are purposefully targeting civilians. Here's an obvious example, right? You're using a first-person view drone that you can see what you're attacking. You can see this is a bus. This is obviously a bus. This is not a military vehicle. And war criminals tried to drop an explosive from a drone on a passenger bus in Kherson. The item landed right next to the vehicle. 20 people on board. Thankfully, there was shock, but no injuries. They are just terrorizing the population there. And as I say, that's one of a number that happen on a daily basis. Okay, last night in terms of distance munitions and whatnot, we have another huge strike from the Russians, or a huge wave. Fairly large missile and drone attack. There were 87 Shahed drones, 56 were shot down, so that leaves you another 31. Of those 31, another 25 were down due to electronic warfare. So electronic warfare is playing a bigger and bigger role in intercepting these Russian Shaheds. And that leaves then 6. So 6 out of 87 got through. That's still, 6 drones potentially hitting their target. Still a real challenge for the Ukrainians, but that's not bad. 2 out of 4 missiles, KH-69s and 59 or 69, were shot down as well. Or they might be Iskander K or M, who knows. But 2 out of 4 missiles, either ballistic or cruise, were taken out. Just to hear Stephen Bendal, he's married to a Ukrainian. He's from Norway. I've interviewed him. Go and check out my interview with him. Just search Stephen Bendal and see what he has to say about the war. Really interesting. He's a good man. He's evidently in Kiev at the moment. He's visiting there. I counted, so reporting from Kiev, I counted 11 air alarms this night. It could have been more. I might have missed a few. 11 are the minimum. No explosions though in our area, but the firing of anti-aircraft guns was heard in the eastern part of Kiev. Just the terror of being woken up over and over is quite powerful. They expect it to get worse as Putler's birthday is coming up. Wow. So I've talked about the psychological drain that this has on all of the population, but particularly around these hot areas like Kiev that are going to receive an awful lot more drones than, I don't know, somewhere else in the middle of nowhere. The effect that has on people's sleep patterns and therefore their strength, their morale is going to be huge, and it's a real shame. The enemy attacked Odessa at night with Shaheds. As a result, warehouses and trucks were damaged. One man was hospitalized with serious injuries. So Odessa seems to be on the target for the Russians. On the other hand, a fire occurred in Kuzminki in Moscow Oblast, it likely following an attack by an unidentified drone. So this is a long way for the Ukrainian drones to go. According to Russian media, local residents reported hearing an explosion and automatic gunfire near the Moscow Higher Combined Arms Command School. So this is a command school. It's a military facility in the Moscow Oblast that has been hit by a drone, it appears. But I haven't heard of any other wide-scale Ukrainian drone activity. Okay, I almost showed this to you yesterday, but I didn't because it was like, yeah, okay, some explosions, whatever. What was I was quite surprised because it looked like it was Storm Shadows being... So the claim was Ukrainian General Staff claiming that their defense forces hit 3 Russian command posts with Storm Shadow missiles and Gimler's rockets. The results of the strikes are being specified. You see Storm Shadows hitting these big targets, like whether it be ships in Sevastopol or the naval command... Central Naval Command in Sevastopol, so on and so forth. And then here you can't quite tell what's being hit and whether it's significant or not, but there is a little bit of talk about it. Ukraine hit 3 Russian command posts with Storm Shadows and Gimlers. The results of the strikes are being clarified, says the Ukrainian General Staff, and that's in the Kyiv Independent there. So they are. It's just the first time I've heard of Storm Shadows being used for some time. So it means evidently they do have some, and wherever this was and whatever is hit, you would assume it had to have been fairly significant for them to use Storm Shadows to do that. So who knows where that was and what it was. Okay, Rob Lee, reporting from Pravda, says the Russians are, well, quoting them, the Russians are increasingly using unspecified types of drones in addition to Shahed drones. In particular, commenting on the results of the air battle of the night of 4th to the 5th of October, Yuri Ignat said that 3 Shahed drones had been shot down, while the remaining 10 drones were lost in the southern and northern regions. There's a high degree of certainty that these could have been drones of other types, the identification of which is conducted by specialists on the ground once they're detected. So the Russians adapting, maybe, certainly using different drones. Could that be because they are running out of Shaheeds, or they need drones from elsewhere, or I don't know, but they are using a greater variety of drones. Zelensky has said in one of his addresses what is most needed is strikes on Russian airfields. Quote, every destroyed base of the Russian military, every destroyed base of Russian aircraft, every destroyed warehouse with bombs means saving the lives of Ukrainians. It is real support for the front. Absolutely, and there must be such a frustration that they just need to be able to hit these air bases deep inside Russia. And of course, well, I say of course, we know that they've developed the Neptune, they are developing that Palientsia drone, or they've developed it. There are these munitions that appear to be improvements on their ability to strike at long distances. The Ukrainians must have been working surely insanely hard. They've known for months and months, 6 months, a year, that they can't shoot deep into Russia with Western provided weapons. The Americans seem to be hinting that they are working, the Ukrainians have the ability to do that. Is it scaled up? At some point we are going to see surely a wide scale attack into Russian airspace, in deep into Russia, with long range missiles, Neptunes or whatever equivalent, Palientsia, sort of rocket drones, whatever little jet propelled drones, whatever it is. All of these things they've been working on, that they surely have been working on for months and months and months, years, you might think, are it's going to come to a point where we're going to see a massive strike on Russian air bases. I'm sure of it. They can't have just been sitting on their hands moaning at the Americans for not providing stuff without scaling up and providing and building the equivalents. Right, you've heard me mention 13th. He's a Russian Z blogger. He's been arrested. It's a bit like Evil Gherkin, who is in prison for being too critical of the Russian government. Not from you shouldn't be doing the war. You should be doing the war, but you should be doing it better. You should be killing more Ukrainians, is kind of their approach. Reports have appeared on Russian media that Russian Z blogger Yegor Guzenko, also known as 13th, was detained in Russian Novopavlovsk. Reportedly, he is a wanted person in Russia. Guzenko confirmed his arrest and claimed to have been beaten up by the police. Zblogger 13th detained. Yep, earlier he said that quote, if 10 years ago one old man, that's Putin, would not have crapped himself and would not have gone, as they say, frankly, F himself, and not in a quiet 10 years ago, then all the BS would not have happened and the boys would not have died so much. But now you put us in jail and kill. After which he had to delete the corresponding video message. Guzenko fought in the Donbass since 2014, as well as in 2019 in Syria. When the Russian full-scale invasion began, he was under house arrest for shooting a man in the face with a flash noise cartridge from a Pioneer aerosol gun, and later for using flash noise gun in the air. On the 6th of March 2022, he cut off an electronic bracelet with which he could be tracked by the FSIN, arranged through acquaintances in the DPR to come to them, and fled to war. Since then, he has been trying to officially go to war through the Russian Ministry of Defense, but has been denied due to a criminal case. But he's a Z blogger that is often critical. It's often useful to have these people reporting on the war because they do give you a sense of what they're thinking. Sometimes they let things through. They often give you overt propaganda. Romanov is the same. Other people, Evil Gherkin was the same before he got arrested for pretty much, criticizing the government. they are useful to have to listen to. Euromaidan Press reports that Ukraine anticipates a Russian breakthrough attempt near Zaporizhia, Orikhiv and Robotna within days. Russians are preparing apparently for a renewed offensive on the Zaporizhia front, that's in the south, focusing on Ukraine's bridgehead near Orikhiv and Robotna. Wow, so it could be that the Russians break out in another area of the front line. And then here's a thread. It's a long thread. I don't have time to go through it, but how Ukraine is preparing to defend Pokrovsk. Engineering troops have been digging new lines around Pokrovsk, but also, and for the first time, on the road to Dnipro. Here is a new analysis, including high-res images. This is, look at all the little blue ones. They are minor ones, and major ones are yellow. They are obviously starting to be a little bit more prepared than they were in the Avdiivka area generally, because they got into a lot of trouble for not having built defences, and Avdiivka fell really quickly as a result. There's a Ukrainian site, isn't it? Sunflowers surrounding Dragon's Teeth. So they are, building a number of fortifications in different ways all along that front. Probably worth me going through this thread at some point to give you a sense of what they're doing and where, but you can see that it's behind Pokrovsk and north and south. This line there does look to be rather lateral to the advance of the Russians, so not too sure about that. You would expect it to be north to south, but hey, what do I know? And yeah, there are several rings around Pokrovsk there, and then another one coming like that. But yeah, interesting mapping. Useful to know that useful to see this and know that the Ukrainians are indeed doing something. Here you go. So there's your you've got some lateral ones. Well, you've got the river there. I guess that's a river, isn't it? And then you've got lateral ones being built as well. So that's good news. Anyway, I'll move on now. Ukraine will be in a position to launch, this is what I was referencing earlier, Ukraine will be in a position to launch a new counteroffensive at scale next year with the new equipment it's receiving and brigades it's forming. So we've been hearing that they have been recruiting, mobilizing quite a number of people. Apparently they're doing all right with that, and they're just going through training. They're not using them, they're not rushing them to the front. So one version of events, if you like, is that Ukraine has really fought hard, like psychologically, not to commit troops to places that are fairly desperate, because then you're just piling in ill-prepared troops, rushing them in to defend and losing them and then being attrited. Rather, you try and bleed the Russians as much as possible and cede that territory to them, and make sure you've got a really trained up, well-equipped bunch of people ready for something next year. And this is what appears to be the case, at least according to the Times. It will also likely receive permission to use longer-range American ATAC and British Storm Shadow missiles against military targets inside Russia. Even without them, Kyiv has been using its own missiles and drones in a campaign against Russian ammunition depots and is already having an effect. So, again, it goes back to, and sorry to have taken so long to talk to you today, but it goes back to this idea that in the New York Times article, that, and it's really good to see the New York Times give something that isn't just, oh, woe is the Ukrainians and oh my goodness, how terrible it is. We've got a mainstream media outlet actually going, well, this could be happening here. Actually, this could be a way to interpret it, which is, oh, it's not woe, are the Ukrainians for losing, oh, it's all over, let's just give up now. It's okay, they're ceding that and they are making the Russians pay for it. And actually, when we look forward, when we get a sense of what the Russians have achieved, which is not a lot, and what they've lost, which is a damn lot, and then we're understanding that the Ukrainians might be in a position to attack next year by not committing all these forces to those areas, then it could be that the Ukrainians might be in a slightly better position than we had given them credit for being. But that could be me wanting that to be the case. It could be that actually they don't have that many troops in reserve. It could be that they're not well enough prepared. Or it could be that they've been far more attrited themselves on the front lines than I have been letting on. Although I think they have been attrited badly. They're losing troops, the Ukrainians, of course they are, huge amounts of troops, but the Russians are just losing way more, and I think that ratio is still advantageous for the Ukrainians. Anyway, let me know what you think. Am I well off? Let me know if you think the Ukrainians are having this many troops in reserve? Do you have this many troops in reserve to be able to commit them next year? Or do you think that is psyops? Just from an information point of view, Rebar has been taken down from Twitter. As David D says, Elon took down the Russian site Rebar. I've seen, so it was Rebar Force, and there's Rebar_EN, like English, which has always been there, but I think they're bringing that one up again. So I don't know, but interesting. I don't know if that's to do with sanctions, because Elon Musk wouldn't give a toss about Rebar being on Twitter. It's nothing to do with Elon Musk. It'll be to do with sanctions enforcement, no doubt, to do with information on disinformation on and over military Russian disinformation on social media sites. We've had, YouTube tightening up stuff. We've had Telegram tightening up stuff as well. They're under a lot of pressure, obviously, with their main guy arrested and whatnot. So I think it's more that, less Elon Musk. Russia is saying that the Kremlin-controlled IT, or Moscow Times says, which is an exiled Russian media site, saying the Kremlin-controlled IT corporation VK has begun. So this is like Russian version of Telegram, WhatsApp. VK has begun mass layoffs that have affected not only IT specialists but also other employees. I don't know whether this is a result of sanctions hurting the Russians themselves. We've heard that RuTube, their version of YouTube, Google Play has taken that off their services. Again, that's going to be in line with sanctions. Here, PS01 says Russia is a totalitarian state. Rossiya Airlines has introduced a new code requiring employees to report their colleagues if they criticize a special military operation. According to the Buzzer channel, workers must hand over the personal data of those who photograph objects or disseminate false information about the SVO in Ukraine. So we are getting this tightening of the information spaces inside Russia, and the tightening of the information spaces outside of Russia from a sanctions point of view. Interesting. Anyway, that's enough from me. It was a long one today. Sorry. Take care, guys. Speak soon. Toodle pips.